We live in a time where income inequality is the highest it's been in roughly 100 years. The cost of living in cities continues to increase, but wages have remained stagnant or declined in the past decades, particularly for the lower and middle class. People can't afford to buy a home anymore, and so the market is shifting away from ownership and towards rentals, especially among middle-income families and millennials grappling with college debt. Wall Street has also recognized this opportunity, and it's been buying up the same distressed properties that it put underwater during the 2007 subprime mortgage crisis and converting them to rentals. Now, New York's been a rental economy for decades. With 75% of New Yorkers renting, it's indicative of what's happening in urbanized cities across North America. New Yorkers also spend most of their money on rent. The average American spends 30% on shelter, whereas New Yorkers spend 65%. Twice that of what's generally considered an acceptable amount of a paycheck to go towards housing. As the rental burden increases, so does the amount of economic inequality. And one thing's for sure, families are living closer and closer to the edge, paycheck by paycheck. When you rent, you're not in control of your own home. You're dependent on your landlords. And even though many landlords are great, at the end of the day, these are businesses designed to maximize their bottom lines. This boils down to keeping operating costs low and charging as much as you can get away with for your product. That same general principle applies to every other business in the world. And when you rent, you're susceptible to market changes, and the slightest problem can leave you in a really bad situation. And things do happen, because that's life. The Atlantic recently did a story on how today's average American family could not afford $400 for an emergency medical treatment and would have to borrow if a situation arose. Cities almost always grow faster than their housing stock can be built, which is one reason why demand for housing increases and prices go up. And at the same time, urbanization leads to increased amounts of gentrification. So most cities have put in place some sort of policy to prevent rental prices from going to the moon, because that's exactly what happens without it. In New York, it's called rent stabilization. In Toronto, it's called inclusionary zoning. And in San Francisco, it's called rent control. So cities often create special incentives for landlords to create more affordable housing, and these usually come in the form of tax breaks. Just under 50% of apartments in New York City are rent stabilized. That means the rent can only increase by a certain amount every year, and lease renewals are guaranteed. However, landlords are constantly finding new loopholes and tricks to push out tenants and spike rents. Rent stabilization is essential for keeping New York's retired, underprivileged, and middle class safe from the tides of gentrification, and has enabled countless families to budget, save for college and retirement, and live decent lives. Displacing even one family can have a tremendous ripple effect across generations. One slumlord, Steve Croman, was recently indicted by the New York Attorney General. It's estimated that he single-handedly displaced tens of thousands of families. Fun fact, Steve was my first landlord when I moved to New York. Slumlords like Croman are making massive amounts of money while exploiting poor families and destabilizing New York's housing market, all while reaping tax benefits. And due to blatant legal loopholes, it's often legal. Landlord negligence costs the city at least $750 million per year, all of which falls on the taxpayers. You get this number through adding up the cost of physical building inspections, fielding 311 calls, legal issues, overworked and backed up housing courts, health complications leading to short and long-term problems, tenant displacement, which often puts families in homeless shelters, and more. We've been trying to calculate the exact amount of damages that slumlords cost the city, but every time we think we've got it, someone else comes up with something new. Just last week, the city announced that they're going to spend an additional $100 million to make free or low-cost legal help available to low-income tenants facing displacement. So we're at $850 million for this year. And in addition to that, there are $1.5 billion in unpaid fines, because fines are seen as a joke or a cost of doing business at best. And the laws are, in large part, shaped by landlord lobbyists who make it impossible or very difficult for renters to have a shot at fairness. So here's an example. If you're a landlord and you received tax breaks from the city to produce affordable housing, but then you decide to just put those units on the market and charge the full market rate, and then you get caught, you get a polite letter from the city asking you to please consider lowering your rent and provide refunds for the overcharges. So they're basically asking the people who broke the law to turn themselves in and turn over their money. So, it doesn't work. So policy and enforcement are the best scalable ways to fix social issues, but what do you do in a situation where the other player on the field is the landlord lobby and they hold all the cards? We've come up with a way that circumvents policy and enables housing enforcement to be powered by the crowd and technology. My team and I have been collaborating with city officials from the mayor's office, the attorney general, the public advocate, as well as several nonprofits, civic hackers, data scientists, and everyday New Yorkers that have heard of what we're doing and have come out of the woodwork to try and help. We believe we have a potential solution, and by bringing transparency and accountability to the rental system, we can level the playing field for renters while improving the quality of our housing. New York City has been inspecting buildings, responding to 311 complaints, recording violations, and appraising properties for decades. This information is all collected using taxpayer money, which is the argument as to why it belongs in the public domain. When you start to analyze it, you see clear patterns and trends that go back many years. So we use this data to rank landlords and buildings from best to worst and disclose common issues about landlord neglect, like mold, bed bugs, roaches, and heat and hot water problems, or if the landlord has the tendency to keep the security deposit. We find that good landlords have actually been pretty good for the past 4 or 5 years, and bad landlords have been pretty bad. But the patterns are clear as night and day. So we use this information from the city to grade each building from A to F. These grades have nothing to do with price or amenities. This rating reflects how well landlords follow the law, fulfill their legal obligations, and take care of their buildings and tenants. That's because individual preferences for amenities are subjective, but confirmed violations like mold and bed bugs are not. So in order to help improve this system, we realized the point to focus on was the moment when a person's looking to find a new apartment. Once you're in a bad situation, there's not much we can do to help, there's not much anyone can do to help, and it's gonna be expensive. So we built Rentlogic, and our whole system is completely free and publicly available so that future renters can make informed decisions on where to live and not end up in a building full of problems, which many of us are probably familiar with. We also allow renters to leave anonymous reviews on places they've lived. Reviews do not affect the rating, but help provide more detailed insight into the property. The rating is developed 100% from official city data, and we've coupled these ratings with an apartment rental search engine. So if you come to our site, you search for an apartment, we'll show you ones that are cheaper, within a block, available right now, and from a great landlord. So here we're looking at this listing. The pictures look pretty good, okay. It's a 1-bedroom going for $29.50, and the building's rated an F. So you scroll down a little bit, it's like, okay, I get it. Like there's heat and hot water problems, mold issues, a whole bunch of problems. You can read the description. The broker probably says it's an amazing, classy place with the river view, and it's got like high-end finishes and stainless steel appliances. So we'd probably recommend not to rent in one of these places. And then when you scroll down here, this is where the magic happens. These are 6 apartments. They're all up to $500 cheaper within a block, nearly identical units and from great landlords. This whole product is designed to shuffle people away from slum landlords and towards the good ones, which align market incentives in a much more fair way. So great landlords win and slum landlords get hit where it hurts most, in their bank accounts. Rent is expensive, but so are mortgages, and vacancies and rent reductions are the worst things that can happen to a landlord, which makes it the strongest incentive for them to self-correct their own behavior. Something amazing happens when you start to rate businesses. The grades actually improve over time. Ben Wellington, a TEDxNewYork speaker from 2014, first mentioned this in his blog, I Quant New York, regarding New York restaurant inspections. We ran a similar analysis on Toronto restaurant inspections and also proved that over time, the overall letter grades improve as businesses start to work harder because it increases their bottom line because people don't want to eat at B and C restaurants. And what happened? Despite restaurant industry protests about the collapse of the Toronto foodie scene and accusations of unfairness, the restaurant industry survived and actually thrived. Toronto has some of the best restaurants in the world, a vibrant food scene, and foodborne illness plummeted. Before the program, only 42% of restaurants were in compliance of health code. That means 60% were not up to standard. And within a few short years, there were massive improvements, and today, over 90% are in compliance, which is crystal clear evidence of the public health benefits of transparency. The steaks cost just about the same and are just as delicious as they were years ago. All this evidence is in agreement that a transparent rental economy will have a similar effect on public health. And I believe it will actually have a better effect because people don't live in restaurants, they live in their apartments. This is what happens when the city gets involved with policy and enforcement. But we can't wait on policy to change in New York. It will take too long, and it won't necessarily be in the direction of public interest. If every landlord was rated, and everyone picked their apartments based on ratings, then once we hit a critical mass, the crowd would eventually start to move the needle on building quality, which is something we can measure. This is a different model than we've seen before that uses the crowd to benefit public interest, but it only works if enough people know about it and are using it. Toronto right now is in many ways a smaller New York, but it shows similar signs of what's going to happen in the years to come if this problem goes unaddressed. My company and some of our colleagues in Toronto at Acorn and FMTA, as well as councillors Josh Matlow, have been working on something that's going to be game-changing. So you know how restaurants have letter grades? The City of Toronto is going to start doing that for apartment buildings at the city level. We've been part of the discussion and working with many key stakeholders to shape the bylaw that the city is going to pass later on this year. These building grades will have to be posted clearly in the entranceway of an apartment and will warn future renters of any issues. This actually protects the entire public interest, including landlords, although as you can imagine, there's been a lot of pushback from them. But ironically enough, good landlords will lease up their buildings faster and for more money. So most cities have reactive systems that rely on citizens to trigger inspections. Time and time again, it's been proven that reactive programs don't work. So this is a proactive regime. Every apartment building in Toronto is going to be mandatorily inspected at least once per year to get started. That will allow the city to identify which landlords are good and which landlords are bad. The good landlords are going to be largely left alone, and enforcement will focus on the bad ones. While the details are still being ironed out, the first few offenses might be a series of fines tacked onto the tax bill, but in extreme cases like roach infestations, the city's going to go in and clean it up and then just throw it on the landlord's tax bill. So Toronto stands to be the first kind of city, the first North American city to have this kind of housing policy, and we hope that other cities will follow with it in the future. This kind of policy would never pass in New York. The landlord lobby is way too connected, well-financed, and sophisticated. So while there's no easy solution, one thing's for sure. Our existing solutions aren't working, the rental population is growing, and systems like Rentlogic and landlord licensing need to be put in place now across North America before it's too late. Thank you.